Hello and welcome to the Aviation Show. Brought to you by these guys, yeah. Because here we are, the fabulous Sun Pub in Notting Hill, and I've got Scott Marchand and Andy Boehly from the Pima Air and Space Museum. We have drinks, so I guess we're calling this a pubcast, aren't we?
Yeah.
We're going to find out, A, why you're here in England, and B, what's going on, because you're getting messages as we speak about a very large blue aircraft that's getting closer and closer to the museum. What's happening with the Marchand Mars?
Well, breaking news is it's probably within a quarter mile of the museum at this point. It made it to the I-10 highway and Craycroft cross streets, and they've had to pull up for the day because they've reached the curfew for moving in permit. So we're this close. Yeah.
So after all this time,
right?
quarter of a mile left.
Yeah.
It's been a fraught exercise.
It sure has.
But how long has the planning been now going on for this? Because you've been working on this for a while.
Yeah, so we've had a relationship with the Coulson Aviation Group going back to just before COVID. And how that came about is they had acquired a number of surplus C-130 airframes from the Norwegian Air Force that they had bought, and were going to regenerate to put into the tanker fleet. And we were sort of the closest available spot for that to happen. And I know generally we try to be helpful to other organizations that need a bit of dirt outside a mark and proximity to the runway to get stuff out. And especially if it's, government agencies or people doing real, not to be judgmental, but the important humanitarian missions, right? And, nobody can dispute that aerial firefighting is an incredibly important thing for North America and globally, right? So the Coulsons came in and, did the work for several years, and we got to know their people and their crew, and Wayne and Britt, the owners, quite well over the years. And it sort of came up, kind of casually off the cuff about, so what are you going to do with your Marses, and they're well, we kind of have some plans. Well, we don't have any firm plans. I mean, we want them to go to a home, but, we have, they expressed that they had some criteria, and many of your, people know that there was some talk, probably 10, 12 years ago, of possibly going to Pensacola for preservation with the the National Museum of the United States Navy. And that fell through, principally because the Navy didn't have the resources for indoor display. And the Coulsons were very conscious that putting that airplane would have been convenient on a seaplane around at Pensacola, but really would have just been a stay of execution. Yeah. It's only one major storm away from Dave Hall having an awful lot of plane tag, too. Inside joke, everybody. Many of you probably have plane tags. I encourage you to support plane tags. They're good people.
One of these days, Dave will actually reply to one of my emails.
We'll have to talk to Dave about that, right? Anyway, so it sort of came around that, was available. They'd stitched up a deal for Hawaii Mars to stay in Canada and go into British Columbia near Vancouver. But Philippine was still kind of to be determined. And, and if we hadn't stepped up to it, it probably would have ended up on the ramp next to Hawaii Mars, because they certainly weren't about to let the airplanes get destroyed. Yeah. So we put our heads together, and I talked to our strongest donor and patron in the museum, and the idea of this project intrigued him, right? It was like, well, can we really get this? And I said, look, it's contingent on one critical factor. Can we get it from the closest suitable body of water to the museum site? I mean, flying it into a lake or to a body of water somewhere, that's relatively academic and straightforward. Yeah. Less straightforward than it came to pass, but so we spent some time a year and a half ago, we engaged a professional route survey company. We estimated the size. I mean, as you're seeing now, if you're following this, I mean, the biggest limiting factor was the overall height of the route, right? Which, as it's been rolling, is at 26 feet, which, something give or take 12 meters tall, right? So, not trivial. As it happens, parenthetically, it's become the single tallest load to ever move in Arizona. So it's record-setting from that standpoint. But once we had established that an overland route was possible, I mean, we had the technical team. We've had contractors that we've worked with for years and years and years to move airplanes. And Marty Ventura and his guys, Marty's formerly Worldwide Aircraft, but is now his own entity. And Marty's been a good friend of ours for years. And the next step after determining that there was a suitable route was like, okay, do we have the technical expertise to do this? And Marty was perfectly game, but another critical element in this too is the logistics of crane operations and overland trucking. And we're incredibly fortunate again to have in our backyard a company called Southwest Industrial Rigging, who really specialize in exotic loads. They do all kinds of crazy moves into places that you would never think possible. They were involved with helping us get the wing center section of B-36 here from DFW 20 years ago. So once we put all our logistical heads together and decided that, okay, this is practical, from a physical standpoint, the next hurdle was securing permission from Lake Pleasant to land the airplane there. And that took quite a bit of negotiation, a little bit of involvement from Pima County on our behalf, because Lake Pleasant it's a protected waterway. It's a federal reservoir. There's protected habitat. It's a public entity, right? So they have to provide access to all their Arizonans relatively equally, and not to be uncharitable to them. I mean, I don't know how I would respond if out of the blue some nut jobs come to you and say, hey, we want to land the world's biggest flying boat on your lake, take it apart and move it down to Tucson over several weeks. I would probably press the pause button for a minute and say, like, are these guys for real? Are they serious? Can they do it? I mean, look, to be fair, lots of people talk big and don't deliver. So, once we had them on board, they become great partners and proponents of this. And I think, I don't think I'm overstating, but it's worked out very well for them in the end. They've got a lot of very positive attention, lots of people coming up to the lake to see this. Every visitor who's come to see the Mars being taken apart is paying their parking pass and their day access, so it's generated an awful lot of revenue for the park, which is great for helping them support their conservation mission up there. So all of these magical things came together at our end, and at that point, Dr. Paulson said, yes, if you can get the airplane to this lake, we can get it to the museum. And they very confidently said, well, of course we can fly it down there. Well, it had been a little bit of misplaced confidence because it took several attempts. I mean, third time's the charm.
Yeah, my visit in November was completely scuppered because of one of those attempts. Yeah.
Yes, it was. And that's also, a thing to underscore too. I mean, as is always the case in these type of projects, there's a constituent, a component of aviation aficionados like, oh, it's not going to fly. Why isn't somebody flying it? Oh, it's a shame to put it in a mausoleum. Oh my God. The reality is it's 80 years old. I mean, it's reached into its tether. It's a maintenance nightmare. And look, the Colsons have been trying to sell this thing for 12 years and nobody's stepped up. Right?
And it hadn't flown in how many years? 4?
Oh, it hadn't flown. I think the last time it flown with the Colsons was in 2007, right? So, I mean, we're coming up on 18 years since it, it was no mean trick just to make a variable, right? I mean, it needed extensive test flying. It needed the confidence of Transport Canada to bless this. It was coordination with the FAA. It's not trivial, right?
Yeah.
So everybody there who's upset because we didn't, make a PR exercise out of this. I mean, I think you may have got a sense of why we didn't, right? This thing wasn't going to happen on a schedule. It was going to dictate its own terms on how it was get here, when. And plenty of sleepless nights because at any point in this, something could have gone on. I mean, we're talking, again, an airplane that hadn't flown for a long time. And as we know, vintage aircraft and even regular, I mean, accidents can happen, right? They could have had an emergency over the ocean. I mean, they flew down the coast because if they had any kind of emergency, they can at least land on water, potentially save the crew, maybe not the airplane. Yeah. It wasn't like there wasn't risk in this, I mean, it all turned out well, and we're grateful and excited, but there was no guarantee, and we're still a quarter mile from the museum. So.
Yes, so by the time you all watch this, it could have gone
it should be in the parking lot. Yeah.
So, now, Director of Collections, Andy B.
Yes.
Your collection has grown substantially this year with the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum. I must stop calling it the Target Museum. Not airplanes, so we're veering away from channel specifics, but it's exciting. It's open. How's it going? You guys have been saying visitors are good, and it seems to be capturing a good audience.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the big thing is it's been capturing a lot of a local audience because, this is something that's new for the community. So people are coming in, and we've been talking.
It's the quiet season for us.
Right,
we're heading into the tail end of visitor season.
And, we've been teasing this for 2-3 years now. So people have been waiting for it. So, yeah, and then people seem to be coming in. They seem to be very pleased with what we're showing. I mean, we have a collection of 70 or so vehicles inside aircraft.
On display. Probably an equal number in reserve that needs some more attention.
We have enough. We've been adding more out. We've been adding more outside at this point.
You have a microphone.
I know. But I mean, the cool thing is, much like our aircraft collection, it's a very vast collection that covers many aspects of it. We're not just the tank or armored collection.
It's not a World War II collection.
Right. We had just World War II. We have Jeeps. We have the whole Dodge WC collection. We have representative tanks from America and the Soviet Union. We have a lot of stuff from our more current wars, some Desert Storm, M88 recovery vehicle, which is actually on loan from the Marine Corps and is the actual vehicle that brought down Saddam Hussein's statue in Baghdad. That was a huge publicity event, maybe stunt, outside the hotel that all the reporters were staying.
But
I mean, it was an iconic moment that many of us, saw happen live on television. Mm-hmm. And, I've seen people come in, go right to that vehicle. Some of them know exactly what it is.
Well, what we're finding, too, is that we've had a really tremendous and positive response from, the Army veterans sort of mechanized community. Because some have expressed that they don't really have this type of museum to patronize or be a locus or a home base. I mean, it was kind of startling to us, and one of the reasons even backing it up, I mean, thematically it may seem a little bit of a diversion, but practically speaking, it's not. Because you got to remember that the genesis and usefulness of military aviation really stems to its extended and support of the warfighters and the soldiers, and say, with an airman on the ground. Okay. First World War aviation was an extension of Royal Artillery. It was reconnaissance. It was gaining that height advantage to put artillery where you wanted to go. And it very rapidly, by the last 100 days, the combined arms capability of the Allied expeditionary forces in Western Europe against the Germans would be not unrecognized by anybody today, right? The maneuver, the communications, the synchronization, the interoperability, it was all there in string wire and canvas and that. And, we had the availability of materials. We had space. We had an extra 80 acres of property that we could use. We had interest. We had some funding support. We had a historic partnership with, the Army and the Navy and the Air Force as our historic foreign partners. And there's a vast number of military vehicles within all of these agencies that were looking for homes, right? And it may surprise some people listening, it may not, but they're really, for all the air museums and other types of military-themed museums in the United States, there are very few dedicated vehicle museums that aren't private collections that maybe pull everything out for Memorial Day weekend or a couple weeks over the summer, or the couple of places that exist that are phenomenal. They're really remote and hard to get to. One thing's in Du Bois, Wyoming. There's also up in...
If you're in Wyoming, send your complaining emails about that comment to Scott Marchand and Pima.
Yes. It's been characterized to me as a half-horse town trying to be a one-horse town, right? So, but it's a phenomenal collection, but you really have to be determined to get there. Whereas with our existing Pima Space Museum, the community of Tucson, Southern Arizona, I mean, it's a really collaborative and cooperative environment. Our county partners, our civic partners, have all really embraced this as something valuable for the community. But the Veterans Associations, we some of the first people to step up when we went public on this was the United States Brotherhood of Tankers, who said, "Oh my God, we're absolutely interested in partnering with you guys because we don't have, we want to be part of something, right?" Yeah. People haven't been telling our story, right? The U.S. Army has a phenomenal collection, but, a lot of it's stuck behind secure facilities that, again, out of the right places, like one more in Georgia. I mean, it's, 2 hours south of Atlanta. I mean, these aren't easy places for people to get to. So, we become one of the few places, I'm not saying the only place, but one of the few places where, there's an airport 10 minutes away, there's a major highway, there's tourist infrastructure, there's hotels, there's other things to do when you get there, reasons to stay. So it's been really exciting. And,
just to interrupt, because of all that, is that why it's named the Tucson Military Vehicle Collection, to locate it maybe slightly better than Pima?
Yeah, and that's been sort of the chagrin of our partners at Pima County, who are quite proud of this. But, I've been here 23 years, and I have to explain, what a Pima is, and no, it's not an acronym. It's actually a place name, and it's the county. And people who are in America don't really understand what counties represent in the United States. So, it's kind of like a joke. Like if you have to explain punchline, maybe it's not that fun, right? So if you have to spend too much time explaining your geography, maybe you're not well named, right? And that was really the motivation called the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum, because if you just casually search it, it's going to come up. Or that's presuming you can spell Tucson.
That is problematic.
Which I still struggle with that S and C. It's counterintuitive. It really is.
Yeah.
Andy, when we were last out there, you were showing us some of the smaller objects that are going through as well. What has been sort of that process to get the story of the museum together? Because it's one of the things we chatted about in the episode we did about the behind the scenes at Pima.
With the Military Vehicle Museum. Well, it's been an interesting process because we had no collection, right? So it's not like trying to do an exhibit at
We've
the
been doing a lot of
Museum.
shopping.
Yes.
And Scott has been taking the spearhead on that.
My postman thanks him.
Yeah, sure.
And again, like the Air and Space Museum, it's covering all sorts of
all
eras and
nations,
countries and conflicts and all that kind of stuff. So we've been acquiring stuff from private collectors. We've been acquiring stuff from eBay sales, a lot of stuff from auctions. And we've been trying to target very specific
and
stuff.
We're starting to see donations come through from individuals.
And I was just checking my emails yesterday, and there's a gentleman who served with the Marines in Afghanistan in Iraq with an armored unit and has a bunch of stuff to donate, which is great because we've been acquiring a lot of stuff, but it's all stuff that is predominantly World War I up to, say, Vietnam, right? Because that's the type of stuff that collectors have that they're selling and reselling.
Or that, unfortunately, people pass and it's going to house clearances and it's turning up and on the market. But
And one thing we've seen, even with, contemporary collecting is always such an odd egg, right? And we see that with the Air and Space Museum because people will have this stuff.
There tends to be a 30-year lag after the event before people start to think about doing it.
And they don't understand why we would think it's important to have their flight suit or their, tank.
I mean, I'm not part of history. I'm not that old.
Well, I mean, to circle back to one of your past interviews, John Boyd is a prime example of that. He showed up at the museum one day. He was like, "Oh, I got these technical manuals for the Stealth Fighter, for the F-17A." He's like, "Would you be interested?" He's like, "Cool, sure, yeah. I mean, we'll maybe eventually get one if the Air Force decides to," which they did eventually. I'm there talking with him. I'm like, what else do you have from your career? He's like,
everything.
I mean, literally, he's like, everything. He has his flight suits and helmets from his 8-10 days, stealth days, 8-10 days, and even stuff when he was working at Raytheon. And he didn't think we'd be interested in any of that stuff. And I'm like, dude.
Yeah, the helmet camo that he used over Baghdad.
I know, with his flight suit. I mean, on display in our desert storming. And, and he
was like, who wants this whistle rifle we have? It's in my garage.
And the guy is still, he showed up with a couple of his toy airplanes he had. Like a teenager. So, but it's interesting with this kind of collecting because, it usually does take someone to end of life or their children to think that it belongs in a museum, when that's not necessarily true. I mean, you need to kind of actively collect because so much of this stuff will disappear. And especially when we're looking at conflicts that maybe are different than World War II, where, everyone's holding on to this because
it was a huge mass of material.
Right. And it was, and people holding on because it was the good war and all that kind of stuff. Quote studs for
a good example of that type of thing too is we've got an M47 tank that was used by the Italian army. And a series of random things. We ended up connecting with a collector and dealer and veteran in Italy who had all his armored stuff. And he's like, you're interested in this? Or go, yeah. So we ended up getting this terrific assemblage of stuff. And he gives flabbergasting. They might be, getting interested. But the pretty good veteran Italian tank. This is a great story about NATO and the post-war, evolution of things and the use of equipment and, the arms trafficking, alliances. I mean, there's so many things that we can stitch into this. It's sort of interesting, sort of parenthetically, right? So obviously we're here in the UK filming with you, and I've come over on I guess I'd say working holiday, more work than holiday, but we were invited over to the RAF Museum gala at Cosford to announce their expansion on Tuesday night.
My invite didn't show up, Maggie.
Next time. So we spent the day with some colleagues at the Imperial War Museum, and then at Cosford, and then
Midlands.
Midlands. We went to the.
We'll get in trouble for
proper branding.
Excuse me, I'm not British. Then down to the Fleet Armor Museum at Yeovilton, and then we spent yesterday at Bobbington at the Tank Museum, and we're having a bit of a free day in London before heading home tomorrow. But it's been very productive for us. So it's but what sort of has struck us as we've been touring around is like there's a lot of emphasis on sort of the social history and telling the stories of people. Yet in most of these museums we've been to that are admittedly large object museums, the emphasis is still heavily on the large objects, and these small artifacts of the people who operated these objects are largely overlooked or they're cursory or represented in a very token fashion. And, we are conscious of that. I mean, to be fair, there's bias. I mean, we're all interested in top to bottom, right? So, I don't know how you can properly tell the story of an aircraft crew or the maintainers or the designers, the people at home front, the families, without the practical objects, right? It's not just the heavy metal, right? It's the life support equipment that keeps them alive at altitude, the ribbons and decorations that are a distinction of their service that they wear with pride, is how they distinguish themselves, and how how they tell their own story as they're walking around.
The party suits you're showing us in the collection as well.
Yeah. Right, which are, highly personalized items, much like a painted flight jacket is from World War
Or
II.
those aren't on an airplane.
Right.
Yeah.
And, seeing at a lot of museums, you have the macro artifacts, the aircraft, the tanks, whatever. And there's a lot of interpretive text, which is good. You need to tell
It's
stories.
essential.
Right. And you're often tying in individual stories. And I get some of the stories you need to talk about, you may not have artifacts to support, but you could still get representative artifacts to tell that story, right?
Yeah.
Which is often what we end up having to do because we're an American-based museum. The majority of our donations that often have a provenance in a story are coming from Americans, right? Unless we buy a collection or something that has some, proper background story. So, with what we're doing right now for the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum, our World War I displays are going to be all representative uniforms, right? You get a bunch of stuff to represent a French artillery soldier who would have went to tanks. And, it doesn't have an individual story, but it tells the story that we want to tell. The same thing with our German stuff and our, heavy machine gun British uniform, et cetera. So I think it's really important to have these things because it, like Scott says, it continues to tell the story and it brings in like these personal touches because you see this big artifact.
Yeah.
And
it's relatable.
Yes. It makes it much more relatable because even if you're not telling a story of an actual individual, well, I guess I am going to have to talk about it.
And he's,
we are in the park.
we're all-
Right?
I
think we're scaring people.
Right. Right.
That's all right.
It's fine, yeah.
Clean the garden. That's
But yeah, I always, in my thought with like these like macro artifacts, transport museums, military museums, whatever, you need to have these other types of artifacts. And being someone who went to school and as a museum professional, and that's what the focus is on, right? You're not usually talking much about macro artifacts. We did a field trip to Duxford and stuff for graduate school, and that was a focal point to talk about all these different types of things than what people normally focus on in the museum world. But I think with the macro artifacts, people tend to lean too hard towards that and not focus on the hundreds and hundreds of uniforms, gear, and all that stuff that they have that can tell stories.
Well, unlike anything with aviation, for every tank crew, there's 50 people in the supply chain and the technical chain behind it. There's the people in the factories creating it. There's the designers imagining it. Like, it's all incredibly parallel. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So it's exciting to see that come together. And, even from a business standpoint, the Air Museum's, it's well received, it's popular, it's successful, but we'd kind of, like, with our tourist season and visitor flow, the last several years, it's clear that we've reached sort of a natural high water mark. Like, it's really hard given the climate, the time frame, the population density where we are, of pushing it into a next level. Like, it's just, we could add another 100 airplanes, and I don't think it's going to move the needle. We could build another building. It's not going to draw.
Add them. I'd like to come back.
Well, it's not going to. It is not going to stop us from adding airplanes because that's what we do. But it's not going to. We've seen blips and we're going to see a surge from the Mars, right? Yeah. Is that going to sustain to another 10,000 people a year 5 years from now? Probably not, right? But if we're able to, even disproportionately, I think probably it's fair to say that the number of people who have been veterans of ground forces to air forces is probably a 10-to-1 ratio, right? So right off the bat, we've got a naturally larger potential audience, both in terms of the direct veteran community or the tertiary, the family, friends who want to discover and learn about what they do. Another element we're going to be able to put in the museum that we haven't been able to do at the Air Museum is having more of like a living experience, right? So we're going to have a riding and driving program that scales up from basic, things like Humvees and Land Rovers up to potential rides and main battle tanks, right? So this is all stuff that we're growing into. So don't make your plans next week. Check the website, pay attention. But that's where we're going because people. It's part of the modern heritage visitor's desire to have a more tactile or dynamic experience, right? Which I guess our counterparts in art museums don't have one. Nobody comes in clamoring to see an artist working in the gallery or be able to paint something themselves. Right? I mean, it seems to be a very sort of peculiar desire by people coming to large objects.
Yeah,
right. I mean, a lot of living history museums or railway museums or transport museums all have to have this experiential component, right?
Because I think there's an automatic, expectation to be able to go inside and touch things, when that is not necessarily the reality.
Yeah.
So having some kind of experience like that, or vehicles that they can ride in, that they can have a tactile experience, I think helps fulfill that. But it is a fair point. It is definitely more. And so you mentioned that, I hadn't thought about that. It really is more of a large artifact kind of thing to expect more of some kind of experiential, hands-on approach.
Yeah. So one of the things I definitely wanted to talk to you guys about was something we discussed briefly, is the sort of demographic of people coming to see it, because we're seeing a pivot away from what a lot of us are considered classic Second World War, warbirds, things like that. What are you guys finding with that? Because I know you have a number of aircraft in restoration at the moment that are Second World War, amongst other things. We're going to come to 227 later, because...
Well, let's talk about it now, because that's spot on the target of what you were just asking about.
Cool. I was going to loop it around, but if I managed to get there quicker, bring it.
No. It's direct to it. So, look,
we should just explain what 227 is.
Yeah, so 227, Andrew?
Sure. So 227 is an HH-60 Pave Hawk. That was the one that rescued Marcus Luttrell after the lone survivor.
Yeah. Go back and listen to Mike Cusick's episode.
Yeah, that's a good point to go to.
Mike's great.
Mike was instrumental in that.
Right. So it was a very important mission just because of the historic aspects of it. He had been trapped on that. They had sent a Chinookin that had gotten shot down with all the crew and the soldiers aboard killed. So it was a very hairy situation. The helicopter was attached to 305th Rescue Group, which was a reserve unit based out of Tucson, Arizona. So that has a huge local connection as well, and local guys and everything. So,
and the base are great partners.
Yes,
I mean,
absolutely.
We exist because of the predecessors to 305 Mars. I mean, it is a deeply integrated community, and the community of Tucson and Southern Arizona really embrace the presence of the Air Force there, and we love having them, and it's a really strong mutual partnership. I mean, when we need help with something from the base, I mean, they make their runway available to us for all sorts of exotic stuff. And if they weren't willing to, to support us like that, we wouldn't be able to have things like Sophia here. The GE 740 so long time. Right?
Right. And 227 is a perfect example of that. It had been assigned to the 305th, but the helicopter kind of bounced back and forth between that and its sister unit in Florida. And that's where it ended up at the end of life. As a hangar queen, it wasn't even flying or anything. It's weird. No one really knows exactly why. But
it was just kind of worn out.
Exactly. But it, could have just stayed in DM. But anyways, so it ended up, they flew it back into C-17, and the unit across the road folded the rotors for us because they knew we wanted the rotors folded.
Yep.
I mean, they...
Sure. We also have acknowledged the National Museum of the United States Air Force, who are the loan partners and make this available to us. Right. So they were the ultimate arbiters of taking that aircraft into the historic collection and supporting
it makes sense to me. Right.
Yes.
Right. And with Havoc going through the squadron instead of AMAR, which Scott leaned on, it sped up the process. And, like I said, it was like curb to curb service. They brought it across the road. They were so excited versus, some
of the logistical constraints we get.
Yes.
Right. But, it's now actually out on display. It came over on a Monday and was on display by Friday, which is frankly miraculously fast for us. But
I wasn't going to mention that. But
don't ask me how long it's going to take to get the Mars on display. Right. So
it's in a lot of bits.
Okay, but to circle back to the genesis of this question, that is a contemporary or near contemporary historic artifact that people from 40 to 65 years old directly relate to, understand, their families, their friends, their communities, their schoolmates. It's everything that was happening with the World War II veteran in the 1980s, right, and into the 1990s. the F-16, I mean, it's been in service for just shy of 50 years now. I mean, think about that, right? I mean, it's been in service for as long as the time frame between the end of World War II and 1995. I mean, these are hard things to grapple with as we're all getting older and still want to feel young and hip, and but so what we're finding is that as we're rapidly approaching the not too distant future, the passing of probably the last World War II veterans. So in the U.S., I think we're under 60,000 acknowledged surviving World War II veterans. And most of them, and probably 90% of them, are the ones that technically meet the criteria as having enlisted and joined before VGA Day 1945. But a lot of them never actually saw any action. They were in training, or they just completed training, or they were in transit when things finished. I mean, there's very few actually surviving combat veterans in World War II in any nation, right? So pretty soon we'll be having these celebrations in the last, this generation, all passing into history, right? We have people that were children at the end of World War II who are now passed away in their late 80s, right? So it's the natural progression march of time. But when you have a scenario where few people have this direct personal living connection to these events, it challenges your interpretation. Yeah, right. You have to build more context into it. But that's not something we have to do with something like 227 or an F-117 or an Abrams, right? These are things that are contextually recognizably and relatable. And it's things that people are playing within video games, or if they enlist now, that's what they're going to get trained on and served on, right? I mean,
to kind of follow on with that, it's like I was over there right after they brought 227 in, because we had rearranged the restoration team, John and his crew, had rearranged the F-14 and the Phantom 1 to make room for 227, and we were talking about moving some other artifacts around. And, within that short time, 227 going, there was two guys probably in their 20s that were super excited about seeing it and taking photographs in front of it. Now, whether they knew it was that helicopter, I don't know. The signage hasn't been out yet or whatever. I think to some extent they were just excited about seeing a Pave Hawk up close, because you see them flying around all the time over Tucson, and often, right over your house every dusk with their spotlights on. Going up to night.
Rescue guys, or even rock stars in the military and Air Force, and they're instrumental. I mean, do a lot of humanitarian stuff. Yep. And they're looked up to, they're admired, right? So these are things that people go, I mean, these are wide eyeball.
Right. Yeah. And that is the interesting thing about that, because you look at the service history of that aircraft, it probably did more civilian humanitarian stuff in disaster relief than it probably spent time in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Yeah. I mean, it was heavily involved in rescuing people in Katrina.
And various, both domestic and international. Yeah. And sea rescues and everything. But, I will circle around too. I mean, I think, there is still an interest in the World War II stuff beyond just, like, say, our generation. Because we talk about the wargaming, definitely. It's like
modeling, all of these things.
When I went home for my niece's graduation, her boyfriend, when he found out what I did, was really excited, because he plays World of Tanks, he plays World of Warbirds and stuff like that. So, he's like, well, what World War II aircraft do you have? And we were having this kind of conversation. He's like, oh, you have a Sturmovik and all this stuff, which I was like, okay, well, that's interesting.
That they're interesting because they're interested in the airplanes as sort of a part of a different experience. They're not connected because, like, Grandpa flew a B-24. It's like, it's in my game. I customized my skin. I've done this. And it's a great gateway drug, but it's a different, but it's a different approach into it. And then they're taking different things out of that experience.
Right. And to be fair, my interest in it, I had plenty of uncles, great uncles, cousins, and stuff who served in World War II. I never had any family members that flew on any World War II aircraft. It just became an interest level of mine, right? I mean, the closest was having an uncle who was on Chaco's Clark Staff Mountain Carriers in the Pacific and stuff like that. But, but that still is a personal connection. It's also just closer, like you're saying. If you don't know, and there's people around you that you can talk to that have these kind of experiences, and you don't have that kind of connection. But there's, ways to try to make it as best as we can.
Next question, Mr. Host.
Yes. The Pima Air and Space Museum in Tucson, Arizona is home to one of the largest non-government funded aviation and space museums in the world. Featuring nearly 400 aircraft, the museum is home to an incredible collection like NASA's NB-52 X-15 dropship and 747 SP Sophia Airborne Observatory, to a wealth of rare military types from air forces all around the world, to the first production 777. Whether you're a military or civilian aviation geek, there will be an incredible aircraft around every corner of this epic 80-acre site for you to explore. As the Aviation Show's partnership with the Pima Air and Space Museum enters its third year, we're delighted to say that Pima is truly a top of your bucket list museum to visit. And it keeps getting better, as this year the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum will be opening right next door. To find out more about the incredible collection and the fantastic events coming up at the Pima Air and Space Museum, and of course the Tucson Military Vehicle Museum, head over to www.pimaair.org to plan your trip to one of the world's great aviation collections, and one that now includes tanks next door, if that's your sort of thing. That's very interesting, because I think it's a trend that's been noticeable for a while, because there has been so much going on in just the past 24 years since 9/11, where we have seen a very new generation interact with war in a way that, I'm going to put this quite flippantly, didn't grow up watching Second World War movies on a Saturday afternoon on the TV. Mm-hmm. They watched it on the news. Yep. And became quite active in their viewpoints towards for and against. And I think
more movies made since then haven't captured the popular zeitgeist in the same way that
exactly,
A Bridge Too Far or
the Dam Busters,
the Dam Busters.
Yeah. And I think that's fascinating, and seeing how your viewpoint towards what to go for next is quite different. Because I guess, the warbirds that are coming through are, which you're showing to other YouTubers. Hello, Sophie. And not me. I'm not bitter much.
Hoppy, but
yeah, a little. Well, it's the beer. I find that interesting. But I guess, does that also mean that the conversations, say, with the Air Force, the Navy, and the Marines is slightly more different as you start to try to fill some of those few gaps you have in the modern collection?
Yeah, it is. And honestly, like our loan partners have shifted their ethos as well, right? Like, so 30 years ago, I mean, it was kind of, oh, you want an airplane? Sure, let's sling it out there. I mean, there's some things that are mandated by law to be available, but it's kind of hard to believe how much time has passed sometimes. But the problems are now coming up because of a rather sort of promiscuous display environment, right? Where, things are not being maintained in communities because the people that made the commitment to maintain them, were 30 years ago and they've retired. They're civic leaders, or they're in environments that don't really make it easy to preserve, right? I mean, you put an airplane on a stick in Florida, it's just a matter of time before it's paint's the only thing holding it together, right?
And it's slowly sliding down the stick.
Yeah, right, yeah. No, so, our loan partners have become a little more
circumspect.
Yeah, circumspect and conditional and thoughtful on how they're acquiring material for the Heritage Program, who they're allocating it to, what their expectations are for display. And these are all excellent transformations and maturation, because, it may bother some people because it's not as easy to get an F-15 for your air park. But, when these things inevitably degrade, decline, or become a problem, it becomes the responsibility of the loan partner, who still owns the property, to be the bad guy in removing it, or in many cases scrapping it, right? So they become the great perpetrators of evil that hurt the feelings of all these people who dearly love it, but that's as far as they take it, right? So they're putting a lot more stake and substance into supporting organizations like ours and our other museums in our community who have also stepped up and made this commitment to, provide security, maintenance, interpretation, and access to history.
Yeah. I find all that fascinating because I think that goes to a lot of the conversations that we're going to be seeing here over the next few years with the changes at the Royal Air Force Museum, Imperial War Museum.
Yep.
And I'm trying to word this in a way that's not going to cause the comments to explode, but I think the passion for what we're used to in these museums as people of gentlemen of a certain age, shall we say, as my viewership and demographics goes to prove, is not actually what they're seeing coming through the doors.
Oh no,
as much. And I guess for yourselves as well, we had this conversation last time I was out there, was the civil multi-generation, but then the civil side of things as well are where people are connecting with aircraft, because as cool as it might be to see a line of Harriers, they've never interacted with Harrier, but they know a 747.
Yeah, right. And the airliners, I mean, that's another good example. I remember when our first 747, the GE100, came out, and it was sitting out in restoration. There was a group of college students. They came all the way from Buffalo, the University of Buffalo. They were aeronautical engineers, and they came out to see the 747 because they had never seen one up close. They were all retiring at that point. For them, the 747 was like the Constellation or a Caravel.
Or the USS Constitution, right?
Constitution, right? Right. I mean, it was literally like, I was like, I felt really old at that point, but then I was like, well, I mean, even for me, the 747 was a somewhat old airplane when I grew up, I mean, but it was, I mean, they were just so bummed I was out there, so I took them out there. They got a chance to see it. And also, airliners are something that people have more of a connection to.
Because they've experienced it internally, but they haven't had a chance to kick the tire.
Right, because we all cross, a bridge into the airplane, and that's it, and you're inside it. You never
peering
get to
out the window, you might see it.
And for me, who used to work at an airport, and you're walking around them, so it's you take that for granted there, because most people, it is actually a thrill walking down the steps and having a walk around the back.
I mean, the last time that I had to be was when I flew Ryanair back in 2004.
Well, looking at it sort of, in parallel to that, what we're seeing in the last the last 30 years is, Gen X has aged and had families, and sort of changed how family dynamics worked. Trip planning and travel planning and attractions planning and history planning, it's a much more joint, collaborative, and integrated decision, right? So women are very heavily engaged and involved in steering how, what, and when a family does something with a trip, right? I'm not saying exclusively, but but we are seeing much more family involvement, multi-generational visits, younger groups of people coming who maybe join the services or in engineering programs or working for airlines, coming as mixed gender visits, and they're all taking something different away from the experience. And so I mean, the more diverse, equitable, and inclusive we can be, the stronger we are as an organization.
Yep.
So, to wrap this up, what is the ambition now? Because it's interesting times, I think, is the polite way of putting things. For you guys running 2 museums now,
don't forget Titan.
Yeah. Of course, Titan. Titan is fantastic. Go there. The weirdest feeling in the world is if you get to turn the key with your significant other and you look at each other and realize you've just destroyed a city. Weird feelings.
Or 3.
Or 3 or more. With that, what's the immediate outlook looking like? Because you've been here, you've been networking, you've been rebuilding a lot of those connections with the teams here.
Yeah.
But what's the next couple of years look like for the museums that you're looking after now? Because I think what you said with multi-generational and the like, I think Sophia is an incredible addition because it's wow.
Yeah.
But what's the next sort of 24 months look like?
It's been 10 years since we've built any significant display space. So I mean, a real target there museum side is to build a space large enough to bring in a generation of aircraft that is post World War II. that are very historic. Like, we have a P-80, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that, I know, aviation enthusiasts tend to be kind of dismissive of early jets.
Every Jensen.
I know, it's kind of like, well, it's like the contrast between black and white and color TV, right? Like, all color TV feels recent, even though it might be 60 years old, right? It's like, it's sort of a, it's like, oh, it can't be that old, right? I mean, it's just a P8, right? It's like, so we're looking to, raise funds for that type of expansion, which will, allow us to bring in, a whole range of more contemporary things we've collected, right? I mean, with the exception of our main hangar, I mean, all of our other display facilities have really kind of into World War II, right?
World War II, Korea.
Yeah. And obviously, I think, our vehicle museum is poised for tremendous success. I mean, we're already at the point where we could fill in at 50,000 display space, right? So that's something we need to look at expanding as funds and opportunity presents. We're going to continue to acquire stored vehicles for that. For that as well, Titan Titan's sort of interesting on that because it is by mandate, it's preserved as a frozen slice of time, right? So so we have to be a little more creative on how we make that relatable. I mean, Titan retired. Jesus, I mean it's close to 40 years ago since they committed 1984, right? So. It's in the dark, distant past. I mean, there's people, there's a generation and a half that's been born and raised since the technical end of the Cold War, right? So, for those of us that were raised during the Cold War, well, I mean, it's all relatable, right? But for people that didn't, it requires a little more explaining. I mean, the nuclear threat that a lot of us grew up under, the existential dread of annihilation in 30 minutes or less isn't present anymore, right? So how do you convey to a generation of people who didn't have Reagan and Gorbachev understand, right? And it's kind of like somebody during the Blitz trying to convey to us that, how does it feel going to bed not knowing if you're going to wake up?
Yeah. And there's a part of me, which shows I'm showing my age, that kind of forgets that, my kid didn't grow up with people like Reagan and Gorbachev shouting at each other every time on the nightly news and things like that. Anyways, that's joking. So the future is bright. And
the future is bright. Yeah. I mean, look, not big limbo. We don't have any problems the money won't solve.
Right. Yeah. Right. And, and to kind of continue with like more interpretive side of stuff and getting, people more interested in things. I mean, we're going to redo several of our older exhibits in the next year that need to be redone. We've been acquiring objects to help flush them out and make them bigger. We're going to have some other exhibits that we've been talking about for a while that we're going to start working on, some World War II, some other topics. We have some other collections that are, some artifact collections that are possibly inbound that will make for some really cool exhibits that we'll talk at a later date.
Fantastic. I'll have to see if I can get through the border to come back for a visit. Thank you so much, gents. This is great. Of course, head to www.pimaair.org for all the latest. And thank you as well for continuing to sponsor the show and keep it going.
It is our absolute pleasure.
Yes, and I
do it.
I think it's my round. So
all right.
Thank you for the team here at the Sun and Splendor in Notting Hill for letting us scare everybody out of the car.
Except for Bernie the dog.
Bernie the dog keeps coming back, but we have scared everyone. So thank you so much, everyone. Until next time, bye-bye. I'd like to say thanks to all of our fantastic supporters over on Patreon. If you head over to our Patreon page, you can join the fun for just £3 a month, plus a bit of VAT, get your name in these very credits, and get all the episodes ad-free and early as soon as I get the edit finished. The Aviation Show is hosted and produced by Matt Boehly and is a Boney Abroad production.